The auction house smelled of dust and disappointment, the kind that settles into worn carpet and clings to folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. Sarah Mitchell sat near the back, her fingers worrying the strap of her purse, a secondhand thing with a broken clasp she had learned to hold just right so it wouldn't spill open. Around her, men in pressed suits leafed through glossy brochures, their voices carrying the casual confidence of people who could afford to make mistakes. She did not have that luxury. Every dollar she had scraped together over the past 18 months sat in an envelope in that purse. $750 that represented skipped meals, double shifts at the diner, and her daughter Emma asking why they couldn't buy the good cereal anymore. The auctioneer's voice droned through the lots with mechanical efficiency. Commercial properties in various states of disrepair, each one dissected by cold terminology that reduced buildings to square footage and liability. Sarah barely listened at first. She had come because the newspaper listing mentioned foreclosures and estate sales, desperate language that matched her own circumstances. She needed something, anything, that could change the trajectory of a life that felt like it was collapsing inward, month by month, bill by bill. The Grandview Hotel appeared on the screen behind the auctioneer without fanfare, just another dying relic in a city that had stopped caring about its past. The image showed a building that might once have been magnificent, its Art Deco facade now hidden beneath decades of grime and neglect. Windows were boarded or broken. The marquee that had once spelled out its name in electric glory now hung at a drunken angle, half its letters missing. The auctioneer's description was brief and brutal. Condemned property, structural damage, asbestos, no utilities, demolition recommended. Minimum bid $5,000. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. 5,000 might as well have been 5 million. She watched as the bidding failed to start, the room silent except for the shuffle of papers and the clearing of throats. The auctioneer tried again, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. 4,500. 4,000. The silence stretched. Sarah could feel the building's rejection, its worthlessness confirmed by the very people whose job it was to extract value from anything. Then something shifted inside her, a quiet rebellion against the voice that had been telling her for 2 years that she deserved nothing better than what she had. She raised her hand before she could think about it, before reason could intervene. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. $750. The room turned. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make her cheeks burn, enough to hear the scattered laughter that men tried to disguise as coughs. The auctioneer paused, his gavel suspended, as if weighing whether to dignify such an insult with acknowledgement. A man 2 rows ahead twisted in his seat, his expression a mixture of pity and amusement. "Lady, you can't even get that thing knocked down for that price." Someone else muttered something about desperation that Sarah pretended not to hear. But the auctioneer, perhaps tired of the lot, or perhaps simply ready to move on, looked around the room one final time. Any other offers? The silence was its own answer. Going once. The words hung in the air like a threat. Going twice. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she thought everyone must hear it. Sold to bidder 73 for $750. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed too small to change a life. Yet when Sarah walked out of that auction house 20 minutes later, keys pressing into her palm like they might burn through her skin, she carried with her both hope and terror in equal measure. She had done something irreversible, something her sister would call reckless, and her ex-husband would call proof of her inability to think clearly. But standing on the sidewalk as traffic rolled past, indifferent to her transformation, she felt for the first time in years like she had chosen something instead of simply accepting what was left. The Grandview Hotel stood 6 blocks from the auction house, close enough that Sarah walked there directly, unable to wait even an hour before seeing what she had bought. The neighborhood had declined along with the building, its streets lined with shuttered storefronts and vacant lots, where other structures had already succumbed to demolition. Chain-link fences marked properties claimed by the city, their weeds growing tall enough to hide the trash that accumulated in their shadows. The hotel occupied a corner lot, its bulk dominating the intersection, in a way that suggested it had once anchored the entire district. Sarah approached slowly, her footsteps echoing on cracked pavement, and saw it fully for the first time without the buffer of a photograph or the distance of a screen. 12 stories of brick and concrete, its facade blackened by exhaust and time. The ground floor windows were covered with plywood, painted over with graffiti, layers upon layers, speaking to years of neglect. Above the entrance, the remains of the marquee creaked gently in the breeze, a sound like something dying. She climbed the steps to the main doors, noting how the stone had crumbled at the edges, how the brass railings had oxidized to green, how everything spoke of surrender. The padlock on the door was new, placed there by the city, and her key turned with surprising ease. The door resisted at first, swollen in its frame, then gave way with a groan that seemed to come from deep within the building itself. The lobby opened before her like a cathedral to forgotten ambition. Even in decay, even in the dim light that filtered through boarded windows, she could see what it had been. The ceiling soared 20 feet above, decorated with plaster reliefs, now cracked and water-stained. A grand staircase swept upward to a mezzanine level, its balustrade still intact, though dulled by dust. Chandeliers hung dark and motionless, their crystal drops clouded, but present, waiting. The floor beneath her feet was marble, genuine marble, though covered now by decades of dirt and debris. Sarah stood very still, her breath visible in the cold air, and felt the weight of what she had done settle more heavily. This was not a building. This was a responsibility, a burden, a testament to optimism she was not sure she possessed. She thought of Emma, 9 years old, and staying with Sarah's sister for the weekend, blissfully unaware that her mother had just traded their meager savings for a collapsing monument to better times. She walked deeper into the lobby, her footsteps echoing, and began to catalog the damage with the practical eye of someone who had learned to assess problems in terms of what could and could not be fixed with limited resources. Water damage was extensive. Whole sections of the ceiling had collapsed, exposing beams black with mold. The walls, once covered in silk or velvet, she guessed, now hung in tatters. Furniture remained, overturned and broken. Chairs with their cushions split and leaking. Tables with legs snapped. Behind what had been the reception desk, mailboxes still lined the wall, each one labeled with a room number, each one empty except for dust. She found the staircase and tested the first step carefully before committing her weight. It held. She climbed slowly, one hand on the balustrade, feeling it shift slightly under her grip. The second floor opened onto a long corridor lined with doors, each one closed, each one identical except for tarnished brass numbers. She tried the first one. The room beyond was small, dark, stripped of everything but a metal bed frame and a broken mirror. The window looked out over the street, its glass intact but so filthy that the world outside appeared as if seen through fog. Room after room revealed the same emptiness, the same evidence of lives that had come and gone, leaving nothing behind but stains on floors and holes where fixtures had been removed. Some doors would not open, their locks rusted or their frames too warped. Others opened onto spaces that smelled of animal and decay, where pigeons had nested, or worse. By the time she reached the 6th floor, Sarah's optimism had curdled into something closer to despair. She sat on the top step of the stairwell, her back against the wall, and let herself imagine what her sister would say when she found out. What were you thinking? You threw away everything for this? But she had not been thinking, not in the way her sister meant. She had been feeling, sensing, grasping at something she could not name. This building was dying, yes, but it was also proof that someone had once believed in something grand enough to construct 12 stories of ambition in brick and steel. Someone had hired architects and craftsmen, had poured money and hope into this corner of the city. And if they could do that, why, if they could create something beautiful out of nothing, then maybe she could too. Maybe this ruin held not just decay, but possibility. She stood and continued upward. The higher floors were darker, their damage more severe. Water had flowed from the roof through every level, carving paths through plaster and wood. On the 9th floor, she found a room where the ceiling had collapsed entirely, exposing the floor above. On the 10th, entire sections of the hallway were impassable, blocked by debris. By the time she reached the 12th floor, the penthouse level, the light had begun to fade outside, and she moved through shadows that felt less empty than inhabited by the ghosts of everyone who had ever stayed here. The penthouse was different. She felt it before she saw it. The door at the end of the hall was larger, heavier, made of dark wood that had survived better than the painted pine of the other rooms. The brass nameplate read simply, "Grand View Suite." She turned the handle and stepped inside, into a space that stole what remained of her breath. The room was vast, stretching the entire width of the building. Windows lined 2 walls, their glass mostly intact, offering views of the city that must have been spectacular before neglect had clouded everything. The ceiling here was intact, decorated with elaborate molding and a central medallion where a chandelier still hung, enormous and dark. But what held her attention was the condition of the space itself. Unlike the floors below, this room had not been gutted. Furniture remained, covered with sheets gray with dust. A grand piano stood near the windows. Bookshelves lined one wall, and their contents still present, though swollen and damaged. It was as if whoever had abandoned the hotel had left this room as a time capsule, preserving it in the moment before everything fell apart. Sarah moved through the suite slowly, pulling back sheets to reveal furniture that would have cost more than she earned in a year. The sofa beneath was upholstered in fabric, rotted through, but still showing traces of deep blue velvet. The chairs bore the marks of master craftsmen, their joints still solid despite the years. She opened closets and found them empty except for hangers. She examined the bathroom and found fixtures of marble and brass, tarnished but present, a clawfoot tub that could be restored with effort. The bedroom lay beyond, separated by French doors with frosted glass. Inside, a 4-poster bed dominated the space, its canopy torn but still draped. The mattress was ruined, of course, but the frame was solid walnut, carved with details that spoke of a time when beauty mattered as much as function. Beside the bed stood a nightstand, and atop it, a telephone, its rotary dial frozen in place, its cord trailing to a wall, Jack long dead. She was about to leave when she noticed something odd about the wall opposite the bed. The paneling there was different, darker, more deliberate in its design. She approached and ran her hand along the wood, feeling for seams, for anything that might explain the discontinuity. Her fingers found a slight depression, a place where the wood did not quite meet the wall. She pressed it experimentally, felt resistance, then heard a soft click. A section of the paneling swung inward, revealing not a closet as she expected, but a small room, windowless and dark. She fumbled for her phone, activating its flashlight, and stepped inside. The space was perhaps 10 feet square, its walls lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat boxes, files, and objects wrapped in cloth. At the center of the room stood something that made her heart skip. A safe, large and imposing, built into the floor itself. It was not a modern safe, not something with an electronic keypad and a sleek finish. This was old, industrial, the kind of thing designed to survive fire and earthquake, its door marked with the name of a manufacturer that no longer existed. Sarah knelt beside it, her hands trembling as she touched the dial. It was locked, of course, its combination lost to time along with whoever had sealed it. But the fact of its existence, the weight of it, and the promise it represented, sent a shock of adrenaline through her that pushed back against the despair of the past few hours. This was not just a condemned building filled with debris. This was a mystery, a secret preserved in steel and shadow, waiting for someone to uncover it. She sat back on her heels, the phone light casting harsh shadows across the small room, and let herself imagine what might be inside. Money, perhaps, though she doubted it. Documents, deeds, things of value to someone long dead. Or maybe nothing at all, just another empty promise, another disappointment in a life that had offered her little else. But the possibility, the sheer fact that she did not know, felt like oxygen after years of suffocation. Sarah remained in that hidden room until the phone light began to dim, and until the darkness beyond the windows had deepened to full night. Then she stood, closed the panel carefully, and made her way back through the penthouse, down the 12 flights of stairs, through the ruined lobby, and out into the street, where the city continued its indifferent rhythm. She locked the door behind her, tested it twice to be certain, and walked home with a secret burning in her chest. Her apartment was a third-floor walk-up in a building that had long ago given up on maintenance, its hallways smelling of cooking oil and mildew. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs aching from the hours in the hotel, and let herself into the 2 rooms she shared with Emma. The space was small but clean, decorated with Emma's artwork, taped to walls she was not allowed to paint. The furniture was minimal, salvaged or bought secondhand, but it was theirs, and it was enough. Emma would return tomorrow, full of stories about her weekend with Aunt Catherine, blissfully unaware that their lives had shifted on an axis invisible to everyone but Sarah. She thought about how to explain it to her daughter, how to frame the decision in terms a 9-year-old could understand. We're going to fix something broken. We're going to make something beautiful again. The words sounded hollow, even in her own mind, the delusions of someone who could not afford to be deluded. She made herself tea with the last bag in the cupboard, and sat at the small table that served as dining room, desk, and craft station for Emma's projects. The keys to the Grandview lay before her, heavy and tarnished, and she turned them over in her hands like talismans. Tomorrow she would have to tell Catherine. So on tomorrow, she would have to face the judgment, the concern disguised as care, the suggestions that she seek help, that she reconsider, that she think about Emma's future instead of her own fantasies. But tonight, alone in the quiet hours before dawn, she let herself believe. She imagined the safe opening, its contents spilling out like treasure from a storybook. She imagined the hotel restored, its lobby gleaming, its rooms filled with guests, its marquee bright against the night sky. She imagined herself not as the woman who could barely afford rent, who worked double shifts for tips that barely covered groceries, who wore shame like a second skin. She imagined herself as someone who had taken a risk and won, who had seen possibility where others saw only ruin, who had believed when belief itself was a luxury. Sleep came late, fitful, and full of dreams where staircases led nowhere and doors opened onto empty rooms that stretched forever. She woke with sunlight pressing through thin curtains and the conviction that whatever came next, whatever obstacles rose to meet her, She would not let go of that building. Not yet. Not until she knew what the safe held, what secrets the Grandview had kept all these years, waiting for someone desperate enough or foolish enough to care. The call from Catherine came before noon, as Sarah had known it would. The auction house had sent confirmation of the sale, and Catherine, ever vigilant, ever concerned, had been listed as Sarah's emergency contact on the bidding forms. The conversation unfolded exactly as Sarah had imagined it, each word a small cut, each concern a reminder of how far she had fallen and how little faith anyone had in her ability to rise. "What were you thinking, Sarah? You don't have the money for this. You don't have the knowledge. Do you have any idea what it costs to demolish a building? What it costs to make it safe? You're going to lose everything." Again. The words came faster than Sarah could answer them, a cascade of fear disguised as reason, until finally she said the only thing that mattered. "I know what I'm doing." The lie tasted bitter, but the alternative, admitting she had no plan, no resources, no rational explanation for why she had done what she had done, was worse. Catherine's silence was heavy with disbelief. "Fine. But Emma stays with me until you figure this out. You're not dragging her into another one of your disasters." The line went dead before Sarah could argue, leaving her staring at her phone and fighting the urge to call back, to beg, to promise things she had no way of delivering. Instead, she set the phone down carefully, gathered what little cash remained in her purse, and left the apartment. The hardware store on 5th Street had been there since before she was born, its aisles narrow and cluttered with bins of screws and nails, whose organization made sense only to the old man who owned it. She found him behind the counter, reading a newspaper folded to the crossword, and when he looked up, she saw recognition flicker across his face. The woman from the auction. Word traveled fast in small circles. She bought what she could afford: a heavy-duty flashlight, work gloves, a pry bar, a dust mask, and a notebook to catalog what she found. The total came to $32, leaving her with less than $50 to last until her next paycheck. The old man bagged her purchases slowly, his movements deliberate, and when he handed them over, he said only, "Be careful in there. Buildings like that don't give up their dead easily." She did not ask what he meant, but the words followed her out into the afternoon sun. The Grandview looked no different in daylight, perhaps worse, its damage more obvious, without the softness of shadow to hide it. Sarah let herself in and stood once more in the lobby, adjusting to the dimness, listening to the silence that was not quite silence, but filled instead with the subtle sounds of a building settling, breathing, existing in a state between life and death. She began on the ground floor, moving methodically through spaces she had only glimpsed the day before. The kitchen and staff areas lay behind the lobby, accessed through a door marked "Employees Only." The room beyond had been stripped of its equipment, but the scars remained. Burn marks on the walls where stoves had stood, holes in the floor where plumbing had been ripped out. The smell of grease and decay so thick it made her gag even through the mask. She documented everything in the notebook, sketching rough floor plans, noting which areas were safe and which were not. In what had been a storage room, she found crates filled with dishes, plates, and cups bearing the hotel's logo, most of them chipped or broken, but some intact. She set aside the best pieces, imagining a future where they might be used again, where guests might eat breakfast on china that had once fed travelers from another era. Hours passed. The work was slow, tedious, but it gave her a sense of control she had not felt in years. Each room cataloged was a small victory, each salvageable item a piece of possibility. She found linens rotted through, but bearing embroidery of such delicacy, it made her chest ache. She found ledgers in what had been the manager's office, their pages water-damaged, but still legible. recording transactions from decades past. She found photographs pinned to a wall in the basement, images of staff and guests, smiling faces frozen in a time when the grand view had been new and full of promise. By the time she climbed back to the penthouse, the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows through the dirty windows. The suite felt different in late afternoon light, less haunted, almost peaceful. She stood in the bedroom doorway for a long moment before approaching the hidden panel again. It opened as easily as before, the small room revealing itself with the same sense of secrecy and weight. The safe sat at the center, immovable, implacable, and Sarah knelt before it once more. She tried the dial experimentally, turning it slowly, listening for any hint of mechanism or resistance. Nothing. The lock was solid, designed by people who understood the permanence of security. She sat back, frustration rising, and forced herself to think practically. Safes like this had combination codes, usually recorded somewhere, kept by someone. The owner of the penthouse would have known it. The hotel manager, perhaps. Someone in authority. She left the hidden room and began searching the penthouse more thoroughly, no longer cataloging but hunting. She pulled books from the shelves, checking their pages for notes. She examined the undersides of furniture, looking for anything taped or hidden. She searched through drawers in the nightstands, in the writing desk near the windows, finding nothing but dust and the detritus of lives long ended. A fountain pen, dried out and useless, a pair of reading glasses, a key that fit no lock she could find. The light failed before she did, and she was forced to use the flashlight, its beam cutting harsh lines through the darkness. She was about to give up, to leave the search for another day, when she noticed something about the bookshelf in the bedroom. One section sat slightly askew, its alignment off compared to the others. She approached and pulled at it experimentally. The shelf swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a shallow recess in the wall. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked but intact, and tucked into its pages, a folded piece of paper. Sarah's hands shook as she extracted it, unfolding it carefully. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, and covered in handwritten notes. Dates, numbers, calculations she did not understand. But at the bottom, circled twice, was a sequence that made her breath catch. 37-12-54. The combination. It had to be. She carried the paper to the hidden room, knelt before the safe once more, and began to turn the dial with deliberate precision. Right to 37, feeling the internal mechanism engage with each number passed. Left past 37 to 12, and the dial smooth and heavy under her fingers. Right again to 54, the final number, and then she heard it. A soft click, deep within the mechanism, the sound of tumblers falling into place. The handle turned. Sarah pulled, and the door of the safe swung open with a groan of protest, revealing an interior dark and deep. She shone the flashlight inside, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs, and saw stacks of something that gleamed dully in the light. She reached in, her hand trembling, and pulled out the first object. A bar of gold, small but unmistakably real, stamped with marks she recognized from photographs but had never seen in person. Beneath it lay another, and another, stacked neatly in rows. But that was not all. Deeper in the safe, wrapped in cloth, were other things. Jewelry? On necklaces heavy with stones that caught the light even through decades of neglect. Documents in leather folders, their contents protected from time. Bonds, certificates, papers bearing seals and signatures that spoke of value measured in numbers she could barely comprehend. And at the very back, in a small velvet box, a single diamond, large and perfect, winking up at her, like a promise made real. Sarah sat back on the floor, the gold bar heavy in her hands, and felt the world tilt. This was not possible. This could not be real. Buildings like the Grandview did not hide fortunes in their walls, waiting for desperate women to stumble upon them. Life did not work this way, did not reward foolishness with miracles. Yet the weight in her hands was undeniable, the metal warm now from her touch, solid and real, and hers. She did not know how long she sat there, the flashlight beam growing dimmer, the darkness pressing in from all sides. She thought of Emma, of Catherine's judgment, of every person who had ever looked at her with pity or dismissal. She thought of the auction house laughter, of the man who had said she could not afford to demolish what she had bought. She thought of every hard choice, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt that had led her to this floor, this room, this safe. The tears came without warning, hot and fierce, and she did not try to stop them. She cried for the years of struggle, for the marriage that had failed, for the daughter who deserved better. She cried for the woman she had been, who had believed she deserved nothing, and for the woman she might become, who held in her hands proof that sometimes, against all reason, the universe remembered the desperate and offered them grace. When the tears finally subsided, she carefully returned everything to the safe, except for the journal and the piece of paper with the combination. Those she would take, would study, would use to understand what she had found and what it meant. But the rest would stay here, protected by steel and secrecy, until she could figure out what to do with wealth she had not earned, had not sought, but had somehow been given. She closed the safe, tested the lock, and left the hidden room, pulling the panel shut behind her. The penthouse lay silent around her, patient and dark, and she made her way through it slowly, committing every detail to memory. Tomorrow would bring questions she could not yet answer, challenges she could not yet imagine. But tonight, she walked through her condemned hotel like a queen through a castle, carrying a secret that would change everything, knowing only that the story of the Grandview had not ended after all. It had simply been waiting for her to arrive and write its next chapter. She descended the 12 floors in darkness, the flashlight batteries finally giving out on the 8th floor, forcing her to navigate by memory and touch. But she did not stumble, did not fall. She moved through the building as if it had already accepted her, as if the walls themselves guided her hands to railings and her feet to solid steps. When she emerged into the street, the night air was cold and sharp, tasting of possibilities she had not allowed herself to imagine even hours before. The walk home felt longer than it was, at each block a journey through thoughts that spun faster than she could catch them. What was the gold worth? Where had it come from? Who had hidden it, and why? The journal pressed against her chest, where she had tucked it inside her jacket, its presence both comfort and weight. She would need help, she knew that. Someone who understood value, authentication, the legal tangles of found treasure. But who could she trust? Who would believe her? Who would not simply take what she had found and leave her with nothing but another story of how close she had come to changing her life? Catherine's judgment echoed in her mind, mixing with the laughter from the auction house, creating a chorus of doubt that threatened to drown out the evidence of what she had held in her hands. Maybe the gold was fake. Maybe the documents were worthless. Maybe she had found nothing more than elaborate costume jewelry and papers too old to matter. The thoughts spiraled until she forced them to stop, anchoring herself in memory of weight and gleam, in the feel of metal that could not be mistaken for anything less than real. Her apartment greeted her with its familiar emptiness, Emma's absence, a presence all its own. She made tea she did not drink, and sat at the table with the journal open before her. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, belonging to someone educated and deliberate. The entries began in 1962, shortly after the hotel opened, recording not daily events, but financial transactions, investment decisions, notes about acquisitions, and transfers. She read slowly, piecing together the story of someone who had used the penthouse not just as living space, but as an office, at a base of operations for business conducted in an era when such things were done through handshakes and handwritten ledgers, rather than computers and digital transfers. The name appeared on the third page, Marcus Ashford, and beside it, in parentheses, proprietor. The owner, then, or one of them. Sarah flipped forward, scanning entries, looking for anything that explained the safe, the gold, the careful accumulation of wealth hidden away from the world. On a page dated October 1973, she found it. Assets secured in Penthouse vault, pending market stabilization. Personal holdings to remain segregated from hotel operations until such time as reinvestment is prudent. Value estimated at time of storage, $8.7 million. Sarah's breath stopped. $8.7 million. In 1973, when she did not need a calculator to understand what that meant in today's numbers, how inflation would have magnified that sum into something astronomical. But more than the number, the words themselves told a story. Marcus Ashford had anticipated something, a market crash perhaps, or personal legal trouble, and had moved to protect his wealth by hiding it, where no bank, no government agency, no creditor could find it. He had planned to retrieve it when conditions improved, but he never had. She searched the remaining pages for explanation and found it in an entry from March 1974, written in a hand that shook, the letters uneven and dark. Diagnosis confirmed. 6 months, perhaps less. Will arrange disposition of holdings with Gerald for family trust. Hotel operations to continue under current management until sale can be negotiated. Personal assets remain as placed until I can attend to them properly. But Marcus Ashford hadn't attended to them properly. Either he had died sooner than expected, or the pain and confusion of his final months had stolen his ability to complete the task. The hotel had continued for a time, then declined, then closed, its ownership passing through hands that knew nothing of what the penthouse held. Eventually, it had been abandoned entirely, condemned, forgotten, until a desperate woman had bought it for less than the price of a decent used car. Sarah closed the journal and sat in the silence of her kitchen, feeling the weight of a dead man's fortune pressing on her from across decades. This money, this gold, these documents, they belonged to someone. Heirs, descendants, people who had legal claim even if they didn't know what to claim. And taking it, keeping it, that would make her a thief, someone who profited from another's tragedy. But returning it, if she could even find who to return it to, would mean surrendering the only chance she had ever been given to escape the cycle of poverty that had defined her adult life. The moral calculus was beyond her at 3 a.m, her mind too tired, her emotions too raw. She left the journal on the table and went to bed, but sleep would not come. She lay in darkness, staring at the ceiling, and thought about her daughter, about what she could provide if she kept the money. College, a real college, not just community classes cobbled together between work shifts. A home, an actual house with a yard where Emma could play without fear of traffic or crime. Security, the kind that came from knowing you could survive an unexpected expense, a medical emergency, a moment when the world decided to kick you again just to see if you would stay down. But she also thought about who she would become if she took what was not hers, if she built Emma's future on a foundation of something hidden and wrong. Would her daughter thank her? Or would she someday look at her mother and see not a survivor, but a thief, someone who had chosen easy wealth over hard integrity? Sarah did not know, and the not knowing felt worse than any poverty she had endured. Dawn came without resolution, gray light pressing through curtains, bringing with it the sounds of the city waking. Sarah rose, made coffee, and stood at her window watching people move along the sidewalk below. Normal people, with normal problems, so living normal lives, where buildings did not hide fortunes and choices did not feel like impossible moral tests. She envied them briefly, then let the envy go. She had stopped being normal the moment she raised her hand in that auction house. There was no going back to who she had been before. The decision, when it finally formed, came not from logic, but from something deeper, a sense of rightness she could not explain, but also could not ignore. She would not keep the money, not all of it. But neither would she simply hand it over to whoever could produce the best legal claim. She would use it, carefully and deliberately, to restore the Grandview, to bring it back to something approaching what Marcus Ashford had built, what he had believed in enough to invest everything. She would honor his work by completing it, by proving that his faith in the building had not been misplaced. And if heirs appeared, if anyone could prove legitimate claim, she would account for every dollar, every decision, every choice. She would be a steward, not an owner. The difference felt important, necessary, like the line between falling and jumping. The morning brought with it the practical concerns she had been too overwhelmed to consider the night before. Authentication would be the first step. She needed to know exactly what she had, what it was worth, whether it was even legal to possess. Then she would need lawyers, accountants, people who could navigate the complexities of found property, estate law, tax implications. The list grew in her mind until it felt insurmountable, until she had to remind herself that she had already done the impossible part. When she had found it, everything else was just details. She called the diner and told them she needed a few days off, family emergency, which was not entirely a lie. Her family, such as it was indeed in a state of emergency, even if Catherine did not yet know how profound that emergency would become. Then she dressed in her most presentable clothes, gathered the journal and the piece of paper with the combination, and left the apartment with a destination in mind. The public library occupied a building almost as old as the Grandview, though better maintained, its stone facade clean and its windows bright. Sarah climbed the steps and entered its quiet halls, moving past shelves toward the reference desk, where a woman with gray hair and kind eyes greeted her. "I need to research the history of a building," Sarah said, "and the people who owned it. Everything you have." 3 hours later, she sat surrounded by old newspapers on microfilm, property records printed from digital archives, census data, and photographs from the Historical Society's collection. The picture she assembled was incomplete, but revealing. The Grandview had opened in 1962, built by a consortium of investors led by Marcus Ashford, a man who had made his fortune in manufacturing and steel. It had thrived for a decade, then struggled as the neighborhood declined. By 1975, it was barely breaking even. Marcus had died in December of 1974, and his estate had been tied up in litigation for years, his heirs fighting over assets, while the hotel bled money under managers who did not care about its fate. Eventually, it had been sold at a loss. I passed through several owners who saw it only as potential real estate, then abandoned when even that potential proved illusory. The city had condemned it in 1998, intending to demolish it for redevelopment that never materialized. And so it had sat, slowly dying, until Sarah Mitchell had walked into an auction house and decided to bet everything on a ruin no one else wanted. She found obituaries for Marcus Ashford, noting that he was survived by a wife, Victoria, and 2 children. neither of whom appeared to have maintained any connection to the hotel after his death. She traced them through public records, but the trail went cold in the 1990s. No recent addresses, no obvious online presence. They might be dead themselves by now, or simply living quiet lives far from the city where their father had built his dreams. Finding them would not be easy, and part of her did not want to try. But the larger part, the part that had looked at her daughter's face and promised to be better, knew she would have to. Sarah left the library as the afternoon shadows lengthened and walked the 6 blocks to the Grandview once more. The building greeted her like an old friend, its decay somehow less offensive now that she understood its history, now that she saw it. Not as abandonment, but as interrupted story waiting for continuation. She let herself in and climbed once more to the penthouse, moving through rooms that felt more familiar with each visit. The hidden room opened at her touch, and she knelt before the safe, entering the combination with steady hands. The contents gleamed in the flashlight beam, unchanged, waiting. She began removing items carefully, or cataloging each one in her notebook. 12 bars of gold, each stamped with identifying marks she would need to verify. 7 pieces of jewelry, 3 necklaces, 2 rings, a bracelet and a brooch, all heavy with stones she could not identify with certainty, but suspected were genuine. A stack of bearer bonds, old-fashioned financial instruments she would need help understanding. And the diamond, solitary and perfect, resting in its velvet box like a star someone had plucked from the sky and hidden away. She photographed everything with her phone, careful to capture markings, serial numbers where they existed, details that would help with authentication. Then she carefully returned everything to the safe, closed it, and left the room, her mind already racing ahead to next steps. First, she would need secure storage. A bank vault, probably. Somewhere the treasure could be kept while she sorted through the legal complications. Then she would need experts, people who dealt in precious metals and stones, who could give her honest assessments without asking too many questions about where she had found them. But tonight, walking home through streets now dark and cold, she allowed herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated wonder. She, Sarah Mitchell, single mother, diner waitress, woman who had been laughed at and dismissed and pitied, had found something extraordinary. Not through luck alone, but through the courage to take a risk no one else would take, to see value where others saw only cost. The Grandview had rewarded her faith with a secret worth millions, and whether she kept it or returned it or used it exactly as she planned, she would never again be the person who believed she deserved nothing better than what she was given. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, its complications, its inevitable confrontations with a world that would not understand or trust her sudden change in fortune. But tonight, she walked home with her head high, carrying in her mind the image of gold gleaming in darkness, of a safe that had waited decades to be opened, of a building that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it. The story was far from over, but at least now she knew how it would end. The Grandview would rise again, and she would rise with it, proving to everyone, especially to the woman she saw in the mirror each morning, that sometimes desperation and vision were not so different after all. The morning after her decision, Sarah woke with a clarity that felt almost unnatural, as if the night had burned away the confusion and left only purpose. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that spoke of professionalism she did not feel, and made a list of what needed to be done, writing each item in block letters that could not be misinterpreted. Bank vault, appraiser, lawyer, historian. Each word represented a conversation she did not know how to start, a door she did not know how to open. But she would find a way, because the alternative was surrendering the future before she had even begun to fight for it. The First National Bank occupied a corner downtown that had resisted the decay afflicting other parts of the city, its marble facade gleaming in morning sun, its brass fixtures polished to a shine that spoke of money and permanence. Sarah climbed the steps feeling like an imposter, certain that security would stop her, that someone would see through her cheap coat and worn shoes and recognize that she did not belong here. But the door opened easily, and the lobby swallowed her into its hushed reverence, where even footsteps seemed muted by the weight of accumulated wealth. She approached the first desk she saw, where a young woman with perfect hair and a practiced smile asked how she could help. "I need to rent a safe deposit box," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "The largest one you have." The woman's smile did not waver, but something in her eyes shifted, a calculation being made, an assessment of whether this customer warranted the trouble. "Of course. Let me get some information from you." The process took longer than Sarah expected. Forms to be filled out, identification to be verified, fees to be discussed. When the woman mentioned the cost, $300 annually for the largest box, Sarah felt her stomach tighten. It was money she didn't have. Not really. Not without skipping bills or meals. But she thought of what sat in the penthouse safe, of the value represented by those bars of gold, and told herself this was an investment, a necessary expense to protect something worth more than she could yet comprehend. She paid with her credit card, the one she kept for emergencies, and tried not to think about the interest that would accrue before she could pay it off. The woman led her down to the vault, a room lined with steel boxes of various sizes, each one numbered and locked. She showed Sarah how to access her box, how the two-key system worked, and how privacy was guaranteed. Then she left, and Sarah stood alone in the small viewing room, staring at the empty box before her, and felt the enormity of what came next press down on her shoulders. She would have to retrieve the gold, the jewelry, the documents, all of it, and transport it here without drawing attention, without being followed or robbed or discovered. The logistics felt overwhelming, but she pushed the feeling aside and focused on the immediate, one step at a time. She left the bank and walked 3 blocks to a pawn shop she had passed 100 times but never entered, the kind of place with barred windows and a neon sign that buzzed and flickered. Inside, the air smelled of dust and desperation, and cases lined with jewelry and electronics competed for space on shelves that groaned under the weight of things people had been forced to surrender. The man behind the counter was older, his face weathered, his eyes sharp in a way that suggested he had seen every con, every lie, every desperate story that walked through his door. Sarah approached carefully, her hands empty, her posture deliberately casual. "I'm looking for information," she said, "about authenticating gold." The man studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You selling or buying?" "Neither," she said. "Just trying to understand values. Hypothetically." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he seemed to accept the evasion. "Gold's gold," he said. "What matters is purity, weight, markings. You want to know if something's real. You need an assay, proper testing. I can do basics here, but for serious money, you want a specialist." She asked for names, and he gave her 2, both appraisers who dealt in precious metals and stones, both reputable enough that their assessments would hold up if questions were ever asked. She wrote the information carefully in her notebook, thanked him, and left before he could press her with questions she was not ready to answer. The addresses he had given her were across town, in a district where buildings were newer and cleaner, where money moved in amounts that made her earlier credit card payment seem trivial. The first appraiser occupied an office on the 3rd floor of a building, with security in the lobby and cameras in every corner. Sarah rode the elevator up, her heart beating faster with each floor, and entered a waiting room decorated with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of clients who did not need to ask about prices. A receptionist greeted her, and when Sarah explained she needed items appraised, the woman's expression remained professionally neutral. "Do you have them with you?" "Not yet," Sarah said. "I wanted to understand the process first." The receptionist handed her a brochure outlining services, fees, confidentiality agreements. The costs were higher than Sarah had anticipated, hundreds of dollars just for the initial consultation, more for detailed analysis. But the brochure also explained what she would receive: certificates of authenticity, detailed reports on composition and origin, valuations based on current market conditions. It was exactly what she needed, exactly what would transform metal and stones into something that could be leveraged, sold, or used as collateral for the restoration she envisioned. She made an appointment for the following week, using a name the receptionist recorded with the same professional detachment she applied to everything. Then Sarah left, riding the elevator back down to street level, and stepped out into afternoon light that felt harsh after the controlled environment of the office. She had crossed another threshold, committed herself to a course that would be difficult to reverse once she brought the treasure into public view, even in the carefully managed privacy of an appraiser's office. The walk back to her apartment took her past the Grandview, and she paused across the street to study it from a distance. In daylight, with people moving past it without seeing it, the building looked more pathetic than mysterious, its decay just another piece of urban blight that no one had the will or resources to address. But she saw it differently now, saw potential in every window, promise in every brick. If the authentication went as she hoped, if the value proved even half of what she suspected, this building would rise again. It would be beautiful again, and she would be the reason. That evening, Catherine called. The conversation began with pleasantries about Emma, about her weekend, about homework and meals and bedtime. Then Catherine's tone shifted, taking on the careful neutrality she used when she was preparing to say something Sarah would not want to hear. "We need to talk about your situation, about the hotel. I've been doing some research, and Sarah, this is worse than I thought. Do you know what asbestos abatement costs? What structural inspections cost? You're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars just to make that place safe enough to enter legally. You could go to jail if someone gets hurt in there." Sarah listened without interrupting, letting Catherine exhaust herself with facts and figures, with worst-case scenarios that might have intimidated her days earlier, but now felt distant, almost irrelevant. When the silence stretched long enough, she said simply, "I know what I'm doing. I have a plan." Catherine's laugh was bitter, disbelieving. "A plan?" "Sarah, you bought a condemned building for less than a used car. You work at a diner. What plan could you possibly have that makes any sense?" The words stung because they were true, or had been true until very recently. Sarah wanted to defend herself, to explain, to share the secret that burned in her chest like fire. But something held her back, an instinct that warned her Catherine would not understand, would not believe, would only see the treasure as more evidence of Sarah's delusion or worse, would try to claim it herself under the guise of protecting her sister from her own poor judgment. So she said only, "Trust me. Give me 2 weeks. If I can't show you real progress by then, I'll reconsider everything." Catherine's silence was heavy with skepticism, but eventually she agreed, her tone suggesting she was humoring someone she believed was lost. "Fine. 2 weeks. But Emma stays with me until you can prove you're not living in a fantasy." The call ended, and Sarah sat in the darkness of her apartment, fighting the urge to call back, to explain, to make Catherine understand. But the words would not come, and she knew that understanding would only arrive when she could show rather than tell, when the grand view stood as evidence that some fantasies, some gambles, some desperate leaps into the unknown, occasionally paid off in ways that defied every rational expectation. The next morning, Sarah rented a car, something she could not afford but needed, a necessary expense to transport what she planned to retrieve from the penthouse. She drove to the Grandview in the early hours when the streets were still empty, parked in the alley behind the building where the car could not be seen from the road, and let herself in through the service entrance she had discovered days earlier. The building greeted her with its familiar silence, and she moved through it quickly, efficiently, no longer tentative or afraid. The penthouse safe opened at her touch, the combination now memorized, and she began the careful work of removing its contents. Each item was wrapped in cloth she had brought, then placed into a duffel bag that grew heavier with every addition. The gold bars alone weighed more than she expected, their density a physical reminder of value compressed into small spaces. The jewelry clinked softly despite her care, and the documents required delicate handling, their age making them fragile. By the time she finished, the bag was so heavy she could barely lift it, and she had to drag it more than carry it down the 12 flights of stairs, pausing on each landing to catch her breath and listen for any sound that might indicate she was not alone. But the building remained silent, blind to complicit in her removal of its secrets, and when she finally reached the alley, the car sat waiting exactly as she had left it, undisturbed and ordinary. She placed the bag in the trunk, covered it with a blanket, and drove to the bank with her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. Every red light felt like an invitation to disaster, every car that pulled up beside her a potential threat. She imagined accidents, robberies, random stops by police, who would ask to search the vehicle and discover wealth she could not explain. But none of it happened. She reached the bank, parked, and carried the bag inside with the casual confidence of someone who did this every day. The process of transferring everything to the safe deposit box took nearly an hour, each item carefully placed, the box filled to capacity, and then some. When she finally closed it, turned both keys, and stepped back, she felt as if she had exhaled a breath she had been holding for days. The treasure was secure now, protected by steel and cameras and institutional weight that would not easily be penetrated. Whatever came next, at least she knew it would not simply vanish in the night, stolen or lost, or revealed as a dream she had mistaken for reality. She returned the rental car and walked home, her body exhausted, but her mind racing. The appointment with the appraiser was still days away, but she needed to prepare, to understand what questions would be asked, what documentation she would need. She spent that evening researching property law, found treasure, inheritance disputes, trying to educate herself enough to avoid catastrophic mistakes. The information was dense, often contradictory, full of caveats and exceptions that made her head ache. One thing became clear. If Marcus Ashford's heirs could be found and could prove their claim, the treasure would legally belong to them, not to her. The fact that she had bought the building did not automatically grant her ownership of what was hidden inside it, especially if that property had been concealed rather than abandoned. She would be entitled to some compensation perhaps, a finder's fee or percentage, but the bulk of the value would pass to those with blood right or legal standing. The realization sat heavy in her stomach, a reminder that the path forward was more complicated than she had wanted to believe. But another principle emerged from her research. Possession mattered. The treasure had been abandoned, in effect, left for decades, without any attempt at recovery. If she could demonstrate that she had taken reasonable steps to locate rightful owners, that she had not concealed her discovery or profited from it without disclosure, the courts might look favorably on her claim, especially if the heirs proved impossible to find or disinterested in pursuing their rights. It was a narrow path, full of risk, but it was a path nonetheless. She began drafting a timeline, documenting everything from the moment she had entered the auction house to the present. She photographed receipts, saved emails, kept copies of every transaction related to the building and the treasure. If questions came, if challenges arose, she would have evidence of her intentions, proof that she had not acted in secret or with malice. She was building a case for her own integrity, a brick by brick, word by word, knowing that in the end, it might be all that separated her from disaster. The days before the appraisal appointment crawled by with agonizing slowness. She worked her shifts at the diner, smiled at customers, poured coffee, and took orders, all while her mind churned through possibilities and preparations. Her coworkers noticed the distraction, asked if she was feeling well, and she made excuses about stress, about Emma, about anything that would divert attention from the truth. She could not afford rumors, could not risk word spreading before she understood exactly what she had and what it meant. On the night before the appointment, she barely slept. She lay in bed rehearsing what she would say, how she would present the items, what she would reveal, and what she would withhold. The appraiser did not need to know where she had found the treasure, not yet, not until she understood its value and her options. She would say only that they were family heirlooms, items she needed authenticated for insurance purposes. It was not quite a lie, though it was not quite the truth either. But it was safe, neutral, the kind of explanation that would satisfy curiosity without inviting investigation. Morning came cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Sarah dressed carefully, choosing clothes that suggested stability without pretense, and took a bus across town to the bank. She retrieved a single gold bar, one piece of jewelry, the diamond, items that would represent the whole without overwhelming the initial consultation. Then she placed them in a small lockbox she had bought for this purpose and made her way to the appraiser's office, her heart hammering with every step. The receptionist greeted her with the same professional courtesy as before and showed her into a private room where a man waited, older, silver-haired, his hands steady and his eyes intelligent behind glasses that magnified them slightly. He introduced himself as Mr. Whitmore, invited her to sit, and asked what she had brought for evaluation. Sarah opened the lockbox, removed the items, and placed them on the velvet cloth he spread across the table between them. His reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight widening of the eyes, a pause before he reached for the gold bar, a careful neutrality in his expression that suggested he was working to control his response. He examined the bar first, turning it slowly, checking the stamps, the weight, the surface for any signs of tampering or forgery. Then he set it aside and reached for the jewelry. A necklace heavy with emeralds, its setting platinum, its craftsmanship evident even to Sarah's untrained eye. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the soft sounds of his examination. He used tools she did not recognize, magnification devices, scales that measured to fractions of grams, chemical tests that left tiny marks she hoped would not diminish value. Finally, he set everything down and looked at her directly, his expression serious. "May I ask where you acquired these items?" Sarah had prepared for this question, but speaking the lie still felt dangerous. "They were in my family," she said. "I inherited them recently and need to understand their value for estate purposes." Mr. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, and she felt certain he saw through the evasion. But he did not press, only nodded slowly. "I see. Well, I can tell you that these are quite genuine. The gold bar is .99999 fine, properly stamped, likely produced in the 1960s or early 70s, based on the markings. Its current melt value alone would be approximately $48,000. The necklace is platinum and genuine emeralds, Colombian if I'm not mistaken, with exceptional clarity. Conservatively, at auction, It would bring between $300,000 and $400,000, possibly more to the right buyer. Sarah's breath caught. She had known the items were valuable, but hearing the numbers spoken aloud, attached to specific objects she had held in her hands, made the reality of it crash over her with physical force. "And the diamond?" she managed to ask, her voice barely steady. Mr. Whitmore picked up the velvet box, opened it, and studied the stone for a long moment before speaking. "This is rather extraordinary. A 9-carat round, brilliant, colorless, internally flawless. If it proves to be natural and not synthetic, which I believe it is based on preliminary examination, you're looking at somewhere between $6 and $8 million. The room tilted. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, fighting to keep her expression neutral. But inside, her mind reeled with the impossibility of those words. $6 to $8 million. For one stone. One piece of what the safe held. She thought of the other jewelry, the additional gold bars, on the documents she had not yet examined in detail, and realized that Marcus Ashford's estimate of $8.7 million had been conservative, had not accounted for decades of appreciation, for the way rare items increased in value as they became rarer. Mr. Whitmore was speaking again, his voice calm and professional, explaining the process for full certification, the additional testing that would be required, the documentation needed for insurance or sale. Sarah heard the words but struggled to process them, her thoughts spinning too fast to catch. She thanked him, agreed to the next steps, and somehow made her way out of the office and back onto the street where reality waited, indifferent to the fortune she had just confirmed. She walked for hours, aimless, trying to integrate what she now knew into a worldview that had never included the possibility of wealth on this scale. $8 million had been the low estimate, the starting point. If every item in the safe proved as valuable as the samples she had shown, the total could approach $20 million, perhaps more. It was an amount so large it felt abstract, disconnected from anything real. She thought of her apartment, the rent she scraped together each month, the meals she planned around what was on sale, the years of living so close to the edge that even a small, unexpected expense felt catastrophic. How could that person, that life, coexist with what she now knew? By the time she returned to her apartment, the day had faded to evening, and exhaustion had replaced shock. She sat at her small table and tried to think practically, and to break the enormity into manageable pieces. The authentication would take weeks, Mr. Whitmore had said. Detailed analysis, multiple experts, certificates that would stand up to scrutiny. During that time, she needed to continue her search for Marcus Ashford's heirs, needed to establish a legal framework for her claim, needed to decide how much of the treasure to sell and how much to keep for the restoration. She pulled out the journal again and reread the entries, looking for clues she might have missed. Marcus had mentioned Gerald, someone he trusted with family matters. A lawyer, perhaps, or an executor of his estate. She searched the name in combination with Ashford, with the hotel, with the years of his death, and found a reference in an old newspaper article about the estate litigation. Gerald Pemberton, attorney, he had represented Victoria Ashford, Marcus's widow, in the disputes that followed his death. A phone book from that era, digitized by the library, showed an office address downtown. Sarah wrote down the information, knowing it was likely outdated, that decades had passed, and people moved or died or simply disappeared. But it was a thread, something to pull, and she would pull it as far as it would go. Finding the heirs was not just a legal obligation anymore. It was a moral one, a way to prove to herself that she was not simply taking what did not belong to her, that she was honoring Marcus Ashford's memory by completing what he had started, by bringing into the light what he had hidden in darkness. The next morning, she called the number listed for Gerald Pemberton's old office. An automated message informed her the number was no longer in service. She tried the address next, took a bus downtown, and found the building still standing, but converted to residential lofts. No trace of the law office that had once occupied its upper floors. She asked the building manager, an older man who had worked there for 20 years, if he remembered anything about previous tenants. He shook his head. "Before my time," he said. "But you might try the County Bar Association. They keep records of old firms." The Bar Association occupied a small office in the courthouse, staffed by a single clerk who looked barely old enough to have graduated college. Sarah explained what she needed, and the young woman typed into her computer with casual efficiency. "Gerald Pemberton," she read from the screen. "Admitted 1948. Disbarred. 1989 for ethics violations. Died 2003. No firm information after 1989. Sarah felt her hope deflate. A dead end, literally. But she pressed anyway. What about the people he worked with? Partners? Associates? The clerk shrugged. Records that old aren't digitized. You'd have to go through the physical archives. They're in the basement. It'll take time. Sarah spent the rest of the day in that basement, surrounded by boxes of files that smelled of mold and age, searching through documents that chronicled the professional lives of lawyers long retired or dead. She found references to Gerald Pemberton, to his work on the Ashford estate, but nothing that led her closer to Victoria or her children. The trail had gone cold, scattered by time and the indifference of systems that did not preserve what they did not value. She emerged from the courthouse as the afternoon light failed, her clothes dusty, her hands stained with old ink, her frustration a tight knot in her chest. Finding the heirs was proving more difficult than she had anticipated, and every day that passed without progress felt like another day of living in limbo, unable to move forward, but also unable to go back. She needed help, professional help, someone who knew how to trace family trees and uncover records that ordinary searches could not reach. That thought led her to a genealogist, a woman whose advertisement she found in the back of a magazine at the library. The initial consultation was free, conducted over the phone, and when Sarah explained what she needed, the genealogist, whose name was Margaret, listened with interest that felt genuine rather than merely professional. "Finding descendants is complicated," Margaret said, "but not impossible. I'll need names, dates, locations, anything you have. The more information you can provide, the better my chances." Sarah gave her everything she had found. Marcus Ashford, born 1921, died 1974, married to Victoria, 2 children whose names she did not know, business interests in manufacturing and steel, owner of the Grandview Hotel. Margaret took notes, asked clarifying questions, then quoted a fee that made Sarah wince. $2,000 for a comprehensive search, with no guarantee of results. It was money Sarah did not have, not without selling something or taking on debt that would be difficult to repay if the heirs materialized and claimed everything. But she agreed anyway, because the alternative was trying to do it herself and wasting weeks or months that could be spent moving forward. Margaret promised results within 30 days and sent a contract that Sarah signed with hands that trembled slightly. Another commitment, another expense, another step deeper into a situation that was rapidly growing beyond her control. She told herself it was necessary. The due diligence required expense, that proving her integrity was worth the cost. But late at night, when sleep would not come, she wondered if she was making mistakes that would destroy her, even if the treasure proved real. The appraiser called 2 weeks later with preliminary results. Everything she had brought was authentic, valuable, worth even more than his initial estimates once full provenance research was completed. So he asked if she wanted to proceed with comprehensive analysis of the remaining items, and she said yes, arranging to bring in more pieces gradually, not wanting to reveal the full extent of what she had all at once. Each visit to his office, each item authenticated, each value confirmed, added to a growing file that documented both fortune and burden. Catherine called during this period, demanding updates, wanting proof of the progress Sarah had promised. Sarah stalled, saying only that she was working on restoration plans, that she had found potential investors, vague reassurances that were not quite lies, but felt like them. Catherine's skepticism was palpable, but the 2-week deadline passed without the confrontation Sarah had feared, replaced instead by cold silence that suggested Catherine had simply written her off, and had decided that intervention was pointless when Sarah was so clearly determined to fail. Emma's absence during this time was a constant ache. Sarah called every night, talked about homework and friends and the small details of a 9-year-old's life, but the conversations felt hollow, inadequate. Emma asked when she could come home, and Sarah promised soon, very soon, knowing that Catherine would not release her daughter until Sarah could prove stability that remained elusive despite the fortune she had found. The irony was cruel. She had wealth beyond imagining, but she could not use it to reclaim her child without revealing secrets she was not yet ready to share. Margaret the genealogist called 4 weeks to the day after Sarah had hired her, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had solved a difficult puzzle. I found them, she said. Victoria Ashford died in 1992, but the children are alive. One daughter, Caroline, living in Oregon under a married name. One son, Marcus Jr., living in New York. Both are in their 60s now. I have addresses, phone numbers, everything you need. Sarah's hand shook as she wrote down the information. This was the moment she had been working toward, the point where she could no longer postpone the decision about what to do with what she had found. She thanked Margaret, paid the final installment of the fee, and sat staring at the names and numbers until they blurred. Caroline Ashford Brennan, Marcus Ashford Jr. 2 people who had no idea their father's fortune still existed, who had probably long ago made peace with its loss, who were about to have their lives disrupted by a stranger bearing news they had no reason to believe. She did not call them that day, or the next. She needed time to prepare, to decide what to say, how to explain without sounding like she was asking for permission to keep what was legally theirs. She drafted letters, then discarded them as too formal, too cold. She wrote scripts for phone calls, then realized no script could cover the complexity of what she needed to convey. In the end, she decided to approach them honestly, to explain everything, to offer transparency and partnership rather than demanding judgment. The call to Caroline went to voicemail, and Sarah left a message that felt inadequate, even as she spoke it. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I recently purchased a property in the city that was once owned by your father. I've discovered something I believe belonged to him, and I'd like to discuss it with you at your earliest convenience. Her voice shook slightly as she left her number, and when she hung up, she felt exposed, as if she had just handed control of her future to someone she had never met and could not predict. Marcus Jr. answered on the 3rd ring, his voice brisk, professional, the tone of someone accustomed to screening calls. Sarah introduced herself, explained in similar terms what she had explained to his sister's voicemail, and waited for his response. There was a long pause. Then, what kind of something? Sarah took a breath. Items that were stored in the hotel before it closed. Items of significant value that I believe rightfully belong to your family. I'd like to meet with you to discuss the details, if you're willing. Another pause, longer this time. What's your angle? He asked, suspicion clear in his voice. Are you looking for a reward? A finder's fee? Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm looking for what's right, she said. Your father built something important. and I think he would have wanted his family to benefit from what he left behind. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to explain in person. I'll come to you, wherever is convenient." The silence that followed felt like judgment, and Sarah braced herself for rejection. But finally, Marcus Jr. said, "All right. Next Tuesday, my office in Manhattan. 2 o'clock. Don't be late." He gave her the address and hung up before she could respond, leaving her holding a phone and staring at a future that had just accelerated beyond her control. She had 1 week to prepare for a meeting that would determine whether she lost everything or gained a partnership that might, just might, let her keep both the treasure and her integrity. That week passed in a blur of preparation. She compiled documents, created presentations, rehearsed her pitch until she could deliver it without notes. She bought a plane ticket she could not afford, borrowed a suit from a thrift store that fit well enough to suggest professionalism, and made arrangements with the diner for time off that her manager granted reluctantly. Everything hinged on Tuesday, on a conversation with a man she had never met, in a city that felt as foreign as the fortune she had found. The night before the flight, Emma called, her voice small and uncertain. "Mom, when am I coming home? Catherine says you're not ready yet, but I miss you." Sarah's throat closed, tears burning behind her eyes. "Soon, baby," she managed. "I'm working on something that's going to make everything better. I promise." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "You always say that." And it was true. Sarah had said it before, had promised improvements that never materialized, had believed in futures that dissolved under the weight of reality. But this time felt different. This time, she had proof, had value measured in millions, had a chance to become the mother Emma deserved, rather than the one circumstances had forced her to be. "I know," she said softly, "but this time I mean it. This time it's real. I love you so much. I love you too," Emma whispered. And then Catherine's voice came on the line, brisk and cold, telling Emma it was time for bed, so ending the call before Sarah could say anything more. She sat in the darkness of her apartment, holding the phone long after the line went dead, and let the tears come, hot and bitter and necessary. Tomorrow she would fly to New York. Tomorrow she would face Marcus Ashford's son. Tomorrow her future would be decided, one way or another. But tonight, she allowed herself to grieve for all the time lost, for all the promises broken, for the daughter who deserved better than a mother who gambled futures on condemned buildings and hidden treasure. Morning came too quickly, bringing with it a nervous energy that made her hands shake as she dressed, as she checked her documents one final time, as she locked her apartment and made her way to the bus that would take her to the airport. The flight was short, but felt eternal, now her thoughts cycling through every possible outcome, every argument Marcus Jr. might make, every way the meeting could go wrong. By the time the plane touched down in New York, she felt wrung out, exhausted by anticipation. The taxi ride to his office took her through streets that gleamed with wealth, buildings that reached toward the sky with the same ambition Marcus Ashford must have felt when he built the Grandview. She paid the driver with money she could not spare and stepped out onto a sidewalk that felt harder, colder, less forgiving than the streets of her own city. The building before her was steel and glass, modern and imposing, and she entered its lobby feeling small and out of place, certain that everyone could see through her borrowed suit to the diner waitress beneath. Security directed her to the 42nd floor, where Marcus Ashford Jr.'s firm occupied half the level, its reception area decorated with art that cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. She gave her name to the receptionist, who made a call, then directed her to wait. The minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last, until finally a door opened and a man appeared, tall, silver-haired, his resemblance to the photographs of his father unmistakable. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice giving nothing away. "Come in." She followed him into an office that overlooked the city, its windows framing a view that made her dizzy with vertigo and possibility. He gestured to a chair, sat behind his desk, and folded his hands, waiting. "So," he said, "tell me about this discovery." And Sarah, taking a breath that felt like the first breath of a new life, began to speak. And Sarah's voice came out steadier than she expected, her hands resting on the folder she had brought, grounding her as she began the story she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind. She started at the beginning, at the auction house, where men in expensive suits had laughed at her bid, at the condemned building she had bought for $750, because it was all she had and all she could risk. She described the first walk through the lobby, the climb to the penthouse, the discovery of the hidden room and the safe embedded in the floor. She watched Marcus Jr.'s face as she spoke, searching for skepticism or anger, but found only careful attention, the expression of a man trained to listen before judging. When she reached the moment of opening the safe, she paused and opened her folder, and sliding across the desk, photographs of the gold bars, the jewelry, the diamond, each image accompanied by authentication certificates from Mr. Whitmore, bearing values that spoke for themselves. Marcus Jr. studied them silently, his jaw tightening as he processed what he was seeing. His father's fortune, hidden and forgotten, preserved by accident in a building everyone had abandoned. Sarah continued, explaining her research, her search for the heirs, her hiring of Margaret the genealogist, her determination to do the right thing even when keeping silent would have been easier and far more profitable. When she finished, the silence stretched long enough that she began to fear she had miscalculated, that honesty had been the wrong strategy after all. But then Marcus Jr. leaned back in his chair and spoke, his voice carrying an emotion she could not quite identify. "My father died when I was 12 years old. My mother spent the next 15 years fighting with his business partners, with creditors, with lawyers who promised they could recover something from the wreckage of his estate. By the time it was over, there was nothing left. The hotel was sold at a loss, the manufacturing interests were liquidated to pay debts, and my mother died, believing he had left us with nothing but his name and a legacy of broken promises. Do you understand what you're telling me? That all that time, while we struggled, while my mother worked herself to exhaustion trying to maintain some dignity, there was a fortune sitting in a wall, waiting." Sarah felt the weight of his words, the anger beneath them, the grief that had calcified over decades into something harder. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I can't imagine what that must feel like. But I'm here now, telling you, because I believe your father would have wanted you to know. He didn't hide this to hurt anyone. The journal suggests he was trying to protect it during a crisis, and then he died before he could retrieve it. It was an interrupted story, not a betrayal." Marcus Jr. stared at her for a long moment, then down at the photographs again. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly. "A finder's fee? Partnership in whatever scheme you're planning? Because I'll tell you right now, if this is real, if these items are what you claim they are, they belong to my family. Legally and morally, you may have found them, but you don't get to keep them." Sarah had prepared for this moment. I had known it would come, but the directness of it still felt like a blow. "I'm not asking to keep them," she said. "Not all of them. What I want is partnership. Your father built the Grandview to be something beautiful, something that mattered to the city. I want to restore it, to bring it back to what he envisioned. The fortune is enough to do that, and still leave both of us with more money than we'll ever need. I'm proposing we split the proceeds, half to your family, as is your right, and half to the restoration, with me managing the project. You get your inheritance, I get to honor your father's work, and the building becomes something the city can be proud of again, instead of a condemned eyesore waiting for demolition. Marcus Jr. studied her with an intensity that felt like being X-rayed, as if he could see through her words to the motives beneath. "Why?" he asked. "Why go through all of this? You could have sold the gold quietly, piece by piece, kept everything, and no one would have known. Why bring me into it at all?" "Because I have a daughter," Sarah said, and the words came from somewhere deeper than strategy, somewhere true. "And I want her to grow up knowing that her mother did the right thing when it would have been easy to do the wrong thing. I want her to see that integrity matters, that people are more important than money, and that sometimes the gambles worth taking are the ones where you risk everything to do what's right instead of what's profitable." The silence that followed felt different, less hostile, more contemplative. Marcus Jr. stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city that spread below his office like a kingdom of glass and steel. When he turned back, something in his face had softened. Not much, but enough that Sarah felt hope stir cautiously in her chest. "My sister will need to be part of this conversation," he said. "Caroline. She and I share our father's estate, such as it was. If we're going to make any decisions, we make them together. But I'll tell you this, Ms. Mitchell. What you've done, coming here, being honest when you could have been silent, that matters. It doesn't erase the years my mother spent believing my father had failed us, but it does suggest that maybe, finally, something good can come from his memory." He made a call, brief and professional, then told Sarah that Caroline was flying in the following morning, that they would all meet again at 10 o'clock to discuss terms. Sarah thanked him and left, her legs unsteady, her mind reeling with the realization that she had crossed the threshold, that whatever came next, she had at least been heard, been believed, been given a chance to prove herself. The hotel where she stayed that night was modest, chosen for price rather than comfort, but she barely noticed its shortcomings. She lay awake, reviewing the meeting, analyzing every word, every expression, trying to predict what Caroline would bring to the negotiation, whether Marcus Jr.'s tentative acceptance would hold or crumble under his sister's scrutiny. Morning came with rain, the city gray and slick, and Sarah dressed with the same care as the day before, armor against judgment. The return to Marcus Jr.'s office felt less intimidating this time, familiarity blunting some of the edge, and when she entered the conference room where they had agreed to meet, she found him already there, along with a woman who could only be Caroline. She was smaller than her brother, her hair dark where his was silver, but the eyes were the same, sharp and assessing, the gaze of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Caroline did not waste time on pleasantries. She gestured to a chair and said simply, "Show me everything." Sarah opened her folder once more and spread the documentation across the table, the photographs, the authentication certificates, the estimates of value, the journal entries that chronicled their father's final months. Caroline examined each item with meticulous attention, asking questions that demonstrated both intelligence and suspicion, probing for inconsistencies or signs of deception. Sarah answered honestly, holding nothing back. And gradually, as minutes became an hour, she felt the atmosphere shift from adversarial to something more collaborative. When Caroline finally sat back, she looked at her brother, and some silent communication passed between them before she turned to Sarah. "This is real," she said. "Not a question, but a statement laden with emotion Sarah could not fully read. My father really did this. He hid a fortune and died before retrieving it. And it's been sitting there all this time while our mother—" She stopped, her voice breaking slightly, then steadied herself. "Your proposal, the partnership, the restoration. Walk me through the numbers. What exactly are you suggesting?" And Sarah had prepared a detailed breakdown, percentages and projections, timelines and budgets. She explained that the treasure, based on preliminary authentication, was worth approximately $18 to $20 million. She proposed that $10 million would go to the Ashford heirs, split between Caroline and Marcus Jr. as they saw fit. The remaining $8 to $10 million would fund the restoration of the Grandview, with any surplus to be divided equally once the hotel was operational again. She would manage the project, draw a salary commensurate with the work, but the ownership of the hotel itself would be shared. 40% to the Ashfords, 40% to Sarah, and 20% held in trust to fund ongoing operations and maintenance. The proposal was generous to the heirs, and more generous than Sarah needed to be from a purely legal standpoint. But she wanted partnership, not resentment, and she believed that the restoration would ultimately be worth more than keeping the extra millions for herself. A functioning, beautiful hotel in a prime location would appreciate in value, would generate income, would become something that outlasted all of them. Caroline and Marcus Jr. listened without interrupting, then asked for time to discuss privately. Sarah stepped out of the conference room and waited in the hallway, her heart pounding, knowing that the next hour would determine everything. When they called her back, Caroline spoke first, her tone formal but not cold. "We've discussed your proposal, and we have a counteroffer. We want 55% ownership of the hotel. You keep 35%. And 10% in trust, as you suggested. The financial split remains the same. $10 million to us, the rest to restoration. But we want oversight, quarterly reports, approval rights on major decisions. This was our father's dream before it was yours, and we want to ensure it's honored properly, not just restored for profit." Sarah considered the terms, weighing control against partnership, and realized that what they were asking for was not unreasonable. They were offering her more than she would have gotten through litigation, more than she deserved by any strict interpretation of the law, and they were giving her the chance to see the project through, rather than simply taking everything and leaving her with a finder's fee. She extended her hand across the table. "Deal," she said. Caroline and Marcus Jr. both shook it, and in that moment, Sarah felt the weight that had been pressing on her chest for weeks finally lift, not entirely, but enough that she could breathe deeply for the first time since opening the safe. They spent the remainder of the day with lawyers Caroline had brought in, drafting agreements that would make their partnership legal and binding. Sarah signed documents that represented more money than she had ever imagined possessing, agreements that would change her life and her daughter's life, that would transform her from someone who scraped by into someone who could shape the future, rather than simply survive it. The flight home that evening felt surreal, as if she were leaving behind one reality and returning to another that no longer fit. But the documents in her bag were real. The signatures were ink on paper, and the partnership was established. When the plane touched down, she took a taxi directly to Catherine's house, where Emma was staying, her need to see her daughter suddenly overwhelming every other consideration. Catherine answered the door with her usual expression of weary disapproval, but Sarah did not give her time to speak. "I need to see Emma," she said. "Now." Catherine hesitated, then stepped aside, calling up the stairs for Emma, who came running down with a squeal of delight that pierced Sarah's heart with its purity. "Mom." Emma threw herself into Sarah's arms, and Sarah held her daughter tight, breathing in the smell of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her presence. "I missed you so much, baby," Sarah whispered. "But I'm here now, and I have something to tell you." Catherine watched from the doorway as Sarah knelt to Emma's level and said, "We're going to be okay. Better than okay. Remember that building I bought? The old hotel? We're going to fix it, make it beautiful again. And while we do that, we're going to have enough money for everything you need. College, a real house, all of it." Emma's eyes widened, Really? Promise? Really, Sarah said. I promise. And this time, I can keep it. Catherine's expression had shifted from skepticism to confusion to something that might have been hope, or might have been fear that she was being deceived again. What are you talking about? She demanded. What happened? Sarah stood, still holding Emma's hand, and met her sister's eyes. I found something, she said. Something valuable. Valuable enough that everything changes. I'll explain it all. But right now, I just need my daughter back. Catherine stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fine. But Sarah, if this is another one of your schemes, if you're getting Emma's hopes up for nothing, I swear I won't forgive you. It's not a scheme, Sarah said quietly. It's real, and I'm going to prove it. The next weeks unfolded in a blur of activity that left Sarah dizzy with the speed of change. The full authentication process was completed, confirming that the treasure was worth $19.4 million, more than initial estimates had suggested. The sale of the gold and jewelry was handled through auction houses that specialized in such items, the proceeds carefully divided according to the agreement. Sarah's share, after taxes and fees, came to just over $6 million, on an amount so large she could not process it as anything more than numbers on a screen. But the restoration began immediately, funded by the allocated budget, and that felt real in a way the bank balance did not. She hired architects who specialized in historic preservation, engineers who understood the structural challenges of buildings from the Grandviews era, contractors who worked with reverence rather than merely competence. The first phase involved making the building safe, removing asbestos and mold, shoring up floors and ceilings, replacing systems that had failed decades ago. It was expensive, dirty, unglamorous work, but it was essential, and Sarah oversaw every detail with an intensity that surprised even her. Word began to spread, first through the contractors and their networks, and then through the neighborhood as work crews arrived daily, as fences went up around the property, as trucks delivered materials and scaffolding began to climb the facade. Locals who had passed the Grandview for years without seeing it suddenly noticed it again, stopped to watch progress, asked questions of workers who were happy to talk about the crazy restoration project that was bringing a condemned building back to life. And with the attention came the curiosity about who was behind it, who had the money and the audacity to attempt something so improbable. The auction house story emerged first, spread by someone who had been there and remembered the woman who bid $750 and was laughed at for her presumption. Sarah Mitchell, they said, the single mom who worked at the diner, who everyone knew was broke and struggling, she was the one doing this. The cognitive dissonance between what people knew and what they were seeing created confusion that resolved into gossip, into speculation, into theories about where the money had really come from. Some said she had married rich. Others claimed she had won the lottery. A few darker rumors suggested illegal activity, money laundering, schemes too complex to explain. Sarah heard the whispers and ignored them, knowing that the truth would emerge eventually, and that explaining herself to every curious stranger would only distract from the work. But the vindication, when it came, was sweeter than she had anticipated. It began with the man from the auction house, the one who had turned in his seat to tell her she could not even afford demolition for what she had bid. He appeared at the construction site one afternoon, standing outside the fence, staring up at the building with an expression that cycled through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been shame. Sarah noticed him as she was leaving a meeting with the architects, and instead of walking past, she approached the fence. "Remember me?" she asked, her tone neutral, but her eyes steady on his face. He flushed, recognition dawning. You're You're the woman from the auction. The one who bid, he trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. $750, Sarah finished for him. Everyone thought I was crazy. You laughed. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I'm sorry about that. This place looked hopeless. It was hopeless, Sarah agreed, until it wasn't. So it turns out sometimes the things everyone else dismisses are exactly the things worth believing in. She walked away before he could respond, but she felt his eyes following her, and she allowed herself a small smile. Other vindications followed, smaller, but no less satisfying. The neighbors who had pitied her, who had seen her as the struggling single mother to be helped or avoided. They stopped her now with curiosity and respect, asked how she was accomplishing what she was accomplishing, offered congratulations that felt genuine, even when edged with envy. The managers at the diner, who had scheduled her for the worst shifts, who had dismissed her requests for better hours or better treatment. They saw her name in the local paper when a reporter wrote about the restoration, and suddenly they were friendly, on asking if she would consider coming back part-time, as if her presence might lend them legitimacy by association. Catherine's transformation was perhaps the most complex. She arrived unannounced one day at the construction site, walked through the gate that workers had left open for deliveries, and found Sarah in what would become the restored lobby, its marble floors newly cleaned, its ceiling repairs visible as fresh plaster waiting for paint. Sarah? Catherine's voice echoed in the empty space. What is all this? It's the grand view, Sarah said, turning to face her sister. It's what I've been working on, what I tried to tell you about. Catherine looked around, her expression stunned. But how? Where did the money? She stopped, understanding dawning slowly. The building. You found something in the building. Something valuable. Sarah nodded. A fortune that had been hidden for 50 years. Gold, jewelry, documents. It belonged to the original owner, and I found his heirs, and we partnered to restore what he built. Catherine sat down on a stack of lumber, her legs seemingly unable to support her as she processed what she was hearing. All this time, she said softly, I thought you were delusional. I thought you had thrown away Emma's future on a fantasy. I thought. She looked up at Sarah with eyes that gleamed with tears. I thought I was the responsible one, the one who knew better. And you were right all along. Sarah moved to sit beside her sister, close but not touching. I wasn't right, she said gently. I was desperate and lucky and stubborn. If the safe hadn't been there, if I hadn't found it, you would have been right. Like I would have lost everything and dragged Emma down with me. But here's what I learned. Sometimes you have to risk everything to have a chance at anything. You were trying to protect me, to protect Emma, and I love you for that. But I needed to take this chance. I needed to believe in something. Catherine wiped her eyes, laughed shakily. You're insufferable when you're right. You know that? Sarah laughed too. I'm learning. They sat together in the empty lobby as light filtered through dusty windows. Two sisters who had spent years on opposite sides of judgment, finding their way back to something that might, with time and effort, resemble understanding. Emma visited the site often after that, her eyes wide with wonder at the transformation happening floor by floor, room by room. Sarah showed her the penthouse where the safe had been hidden, the room now empty but still carrying the weight of its secret. This is where everything changed, Sarah told her daughter. This is where I found what your great-great-grandfather left behind, even though he wasn't our great-great-grandfather at all, but someone else's ancestor, whose fortune gave us a second chance. Emma touched the wall where the hidden panel had been, her small hand reverent. It's like a treasure story, she said, like pirates and maps. "It is," Sarah agreed. But the real treasure wasn't the gold. It was the possibility. The chance to become something more than what we were. The restoration took 18 months from start to finish, longer than Sarah had hoped, but shorter than the experts had predicted. She worked 7 days a week, overseeing contractors, and making decisions about finishes and fixtures, balancing historical accuracy with modern functionality. Caroline and Marcus Jr. visited regularly, their initial skepticism transforming into genuine enthusiasm as they saw their father's vision returning to life. They brought photographs from the hotel's opening, images of how the lobby had looked in 1962, how the rooms had been furnished, what the marquee had spelled out in lights. Those photographs guided the restoration, helped Sarah recreate not just a building, but a memory, a moment in time when the grand view had represented hope and ambition, and the belief that beauty mattered. The grand reopening was scheduled for a Saturday in October, when the weather had cooled but not yet turned bitter, when the city's trees flamed gold and red against steel-gray skies. Invitations were sent to city officials, to historians, to descendants of families who had worked at or stayed in the hotel during its original run. The local paper ran a feature story detailing the restoration, Sarah's discovery, her partnership with the Ashford heirs. The story painted her as a kind of urban archaeologist, someone who had uncovered not just treasure, but history, who had proven that even the most hopeless-seeming situations could be redeemed with vision and courage. The night before the reopening, Sarah stood alone in the completed lobby, the chandeliers now restored and gleaming, the marble floors polished to a mirror shine, the walls covered in silk wallpaper that matched the original pattern. She climbed the grand staircase to the mezzanine and looked down at the space below, imagining it filled with people, and with light and conversation and life. This was what Marcus Ashford had seen when he built it, this potential, this promise that a building could be more than shelter, could be art and aspiration made tangible in brick and steel. She thought of the woman she had been 18 months earlier, desperate and dismissed, scraping together $750 and betting everything on a ruin no one else wanted. That woman felt like a stranger now, separated by more than time, by more than money. She had been transformed not just by the fortune she had found, but by the choices she had made afterward, by the integrity she had maintained, when keeping silent would have been so much easier. She had proven to herself that she was capable of more than survival, that she could build and create and lead, that she could honor both her own needs and the needs of others. The reopening drew hundreds of people, more than Sarah had anticipated, filling the lobby and spilling out onto the street where vendors had set up, and a band played music from the era when the Grand View had first opened. Caroline and Marcus Jr. stood with Sarah as she cut the ribbon, the three of them partners in something larger than any of them could have accomplished alone. Cameras flashed, reporters asked questions, and Sarah answered them with a poise that came from knowing she had nothing to hide, no secrets that could undermine what she had built. Emma stood beside her throughout, wearing a dress Sarah had bought her for the occasion, her face glowing with pride and happiness. "My mom did this," she told anyone who would listen. "She found a treasure and made something beautiful." And Sarah, hearing those words, felt her throat tighten with emotion that went deeper than pride, that touched something fundamental about what it meant to be seen, to be valued, to be believed in. This was the real treasure, not the gold or the diamonds, but this moment, this recognition, this evidence that her gamble had paid off in ways that extended far beyond money. The hotel began operations immediately, bookings flooding in from people who wanted to experience a piece of restored history, who wanted to sleep in rooms that carried the echo of another era. Reviews were glowing, praising the attention to detail, the seamless integration of modern amenities with historical authenticity. Within 6 months, the Grandview was profitable, its success exceeding even the optimistic projections Sarah had made when planning the restoration. The value of her ownership stake increased proportionally, and with it, her security, her ability to plan for a future that extended beyond the next paycheck or the next crisis. She moved out of her third-floor walk-up into a house with a yard, modest by some standards, but palatial by hers, a place where Emma could play and invite friends and grow up without the constant awareness of scarcity that had defined Sarah's own childhood. She set up college funds and retirement accounts, all the boring, responsible things that people with money did to protect it and themselves. But she also donated generously to organizations that helped struggling single mothers. That provided job training and child care and the kind of support she had desperately needed and rarely received. She established a scholarship fund in Marcus Ashford's name, honoring the man whose hidden fortune had transformed her life, ensuring that his legacy extended beyond buildings and balance sheets to touch lives in ways he could never have imagined. Catherine became one of her most trusted advisors, their relationship healing as the old resentments dissolved under the weight of new realities. They still disagreed, still argued, but now as equals rather than as rescuer and rescued, and the difference made all the space for genuine affection to grow. Emma thrived, her confidence blossoming as she saw her mother respected and successful, as she learned that the woman she had always loved was also someone the world valued. She excelled in school, made friends easily, and carried herself with a security that came from knowing, truly knowing, that she was wanted and provided for and safe. The years that followed were not without challenges. Partnerships tested boundaries, business decisions required compromise, and the hotel faced the same struggles any business faced in changing markets and uncertain times. But Sarah navigated them with a calm confidence that came from having already survived the worst, from knowing that she had built something real from nothing, that she had been tested in ways that revealed character rather than breaking it. The treasure had given her opportunity, but her choices had given her integrity, and she understood now that the latter was more valuable than the former, that being able to look at herself in the mirror mattered more than any balance in any account. She thought often of that day in the auction house, of the laughter that had greeted her bid, of the man who had told her she could not afford to demolish what she had bought. She thought of the long climb up 12 flights of stairs, of the moment the safe had opened, of the choice she had made to seek the heirs rather than keep everything for herself. Each of those moments had been a test, a fork in the road where she could have chosen differently, could have taken the easy path or the cynical path or the path of least resistance. But she had not, and the life she had built was proof that sometimes the hardest choices were the right ones, that integrity was not just an abstract virtue, but a practical foundation for everything that mattered. On the 5-year anniversary of the hotel's reopening, Sarah stood once again in the lobby, this time surrounded by staff and partners and friends who had become family. Emma was 14 now, poised on the edge of adolescence, already talking about architecture and historic preservation, about following in her mother's footsteps. Caroline and Marcus Jr. had become true collaborators, their skepticism long since transformed into respect and affection. The hotel had been featured in design magazines, historic preservation journals, travel guides that listed it as a must-visit destination for anyone seeking authentic beauty in a world increasingly dominated by generic modernity. Sarah thought of the woman she had been, the diner waitress who had believed she deserved nothing better than what she was given, not who had accepted judgment and pity as her due. That woman was gone, transformed not by money, but by courage, by the willingness to believe in possibility when every rational voice said it was impossible. She had found treasure, yes, but more importantly, she had become treasure, someone of value not because of what she possessed, but because of what she had done with what she had been given. She had honored a dead man's legacy, had partnered with his children to complete his vision, had restored beauty to a world that badly needed it, and had done it all while maintaining her integrity and her soul. As the celebration continued around her, as people toasted the hotel's success and Sarah's vision, she stepped away for a moment, climbing the grand staircase to the mezzanine, where she could observe rather than be observed. Below her, the lobby gleamed, its chandeliers casting warm light across marble and silk, across faces laughing and glasses clinking. This was what she had built, what she had chosen, what she had fought for. And it was good, better than good. It was proof that sometimes desperation and vision were not opposites, but partners, that sometimes the most hopeless situations held within them the seeds of transformation, if only someone was brave enough, or foolish enough, or desperate enough to plant them and see what grew. Emma found her there, climbed the stairs to stand beside her mother, and slipped her hand into Sarah's. "It's beautiful, Mom," she said softly. "You made something beautiful." "We made something beautiful," Sarah corrected gently. "You and me and Caroline and Marcus Jr. and every person who believed it was possible. And you know what the really beautiful part is?" Emma looked up at her, curious. "The really beautiful part is that we did it right. We could have kept everything, could have hidden the truth and built on a foundation of secrets. But we didn't. We chose the hard way, the honest way, and look what happened. Beauty isn't just what you see, sweetheart. It's what you build it from. And we built this from integrity, from believing that doing right matters more than getting rich." Emma leaned against her mother, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the celebration below, knowing that whatever came next, whatever challenges or joys or sorrows the future held, they would face them together, stronger for what they had already survived, wiser for the choices they had already made. The grand view rose around them, no longer condemned or forgotten, but alive and vital and beautiful, a testament to the truth that nothing is truly hopeless until someone decides to stop hoping, that no situation is truly lost until someone chooses to stop fighting, and that sometimes, against all odds and all expectations, desperate gambles pay off in ways that transform not just buildings, but lives, not just bank accounts, but souls, proving that the real treasure was never the gold at all, but the courage to believe in something better, the strength to choose integrity over profit, and the grace to share what you find rather than hoard it for yourself alone. The night deepened, the party gradually winding down, guests departing with promises to return, to bring others, to spread the word about the miracle on the corner where a condemned building had become something worthy of celebration. Sarah remained on the mezzanine long after the last guest had left, long after the staff had locked the doors and dimmed the lights, standing in the quiet darkness and letting the weight of what she had accomplished settle fully into her bones. She had been laughed at, dismissed, pitied, and doubted. She had struggled and sacrificed and risked everything on a gamble that every rational voice said was foolish. But she had been right, or rather, she had been brave, and sometimes bravery was indistinguishable from rightness when the outcome proved the risk worthwhile. She thought of all the people who had bought into the world's judgment of her worth, who had believed that poverty was evidence of failure. That struggle was proof of inadequacy, that desperation disqualified you from deserving better. And she thought of how wrong they had been, how wrong she herself had been, when she had internalized those judgments and carried them like chains. The grand view had freed her from those chains, not because of the money it represented, but because of what it had required of her: courage, integrity, vision, faith in herself when no one else had faith in her. Those qualities had always been there, buried under years of defeat and disappointment, waiting for a moment desperate enough to call them forth. She descended the staircase one final time that night, her hand trailing along the polished balustrade, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. At the bottom, she paused and looked back up at the chandelier, at the way its light seemed to hold the promise of every dream that had ever been dreamed within these walls. Then she turned and left, locking the door behind her, stepping out into the cool night air where her car waited, where her daughter waited, where her future waited, no longer uncertain or frightening but full of possibility, earned not given, built not found, a life she had constructed one choice at a time, one risk at a time, one moment of courage at a time, proving to herself and to the world that sometimes the most valuable treasure is the one you create, by refusing to believe that you are worth less than everything you dare to dream. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.